going to start with the fourth aliyah, which is chapter 23, verse 8. So the verse states, chapter 23, verse 8. Says the verse, Lo tita'ev adomi. Do not hate or do not abhor an Edomite, ki achichahu, for he is your brother. O tita'ev Mitzri, do not hate an Egyptian, ki ger hayita ba'aretzo, because you were a sojourner in his land, which is so ironic, because why were you a sojourner in his land? Because he held you there as a slave. So you have to have gratitude to the Egyptians because they let you live in their land, but of course they let you live as slaves.
But we went there initially. Apparently, initially, good for us, right?
Yeah, I guess it just makes what they did to us even worse. Hello, Aviva, welcome back. I hope you had a good time in Canada. Yeah. Well, now we're right next to Rabbi Yosef on the Zoom. So, okay. So the verse is talking about you can't hate the Edomites. Why not? Lagamri, don't hate them completely. Even though it will be appropriate for you to hate him, because he went forth with you with a sword. Means to say that you might think that you could hate the Edomites because they went and attacked you in Numbers 20:18 through 20. But don't hate him because the Edomites, he is your brother, and he's Esau. So even though he attacked you, you still can't hate him. And then, because he's your brother, there's a special requirement to go easy on your brother. And then you're not allowed to hate an Egyptian. Rashi says, even though the Egyptians threw all your males into the city, you still can't hate him. What's the reason? Mordechai. A special thing for you, I'll give you after. Even though they threw your males into the river, you can't hate them. What's the reason? Because they were your host. They were your host in your time of danger. So, which is so ironic. The Egyptians hosted us. Yes, they did one thing good for us. What did they do for us? They helped during the famine. They took us in. And so therefore, even though they cast our males into the river, we have to find the good that they did for us. Now, even though this sounds so obscene and so ridiculous, it also goes to the fundamental message that the concept is one of having gratitude towards Hashem. And it depends on our perspective in life. We could always look at the positive or the negative. We could always look at saying, well, I woke up today and I had things that went wrong for me, and therefore I'm bitter. Or I could wake up today and find these things that went well for me, and therefore I'm positive. So whenever you want to be upset with somebody or disappointed, just remember this pasuk, which says, do not hate the Egyptian because you were a sojourner in his land. And if we can't hate the Egyptians after everything they tried to do to us, that teaches us that we have to look for the good. We can find the good and be grateful for the good. It says the pasuk, the next pasuk, Banim asher yivaldu, hello Jeffrey, Banim asher yivaldu lahem dor shlishi yavo lahem b'kal Hashem, that the third generation of the Egyptians can come into the community, meaning to say that you're allowed to marry an Egyptian, but only by the third generation. The first two generations of the Egyptian, you can't marry. The Egyptian can convert, and then they can marry another Egyptian who converted, and then their children can marry other Egyptians who converted children, but they can't marry you until the third generation. Rashi says, Ushara umos, but the other nations are permitted to marry into the congregation immediately. we see from here that somebody who causes a person to sin is harsher than the one who actually kills him. For one who kills him in this world. But if you cause him to sin, you take him out from this world and also the world to come. Therefore, Edom, that tried to kill us, was not abhorred, and also Egypt, that drowned us in the sea, they were not abhorred. But those who caused us to sin, Ammon and Moab, they were abhorred. The Moabites and the Ammonites caused us to sin with the foreign women, so they became hated. But the Egyptians and the Edomites, all they did was try to physically kill us. Then they were not hated for all of the future. So this is a very powerful verses. And now we go out into some. This is a little bit of a challenging parsha to understand how everything flows into from one verse to the next, because we have a very interesting verse that this leads to. The next verse states, Ki Tetzei machaneh, when you go out to do battle with your enemy, nishmartem mikol davara, you have to guard yourself. Hey, Kobe, come on in. You have to guard yourself against anything that's evil. What does that mean? At the time of danger, you have to be especially careful. And so therefore, when you go out to battle against your enemies, you have to be especially careful not to put yourself in danger. And so what's the law? The law is, you have to be a man who at night he'll have what we call a nocturnal occurrence. He has to leave the camp. He can't come into the camp. If he has this nocturnal occurrence, basically, it doesn't have to be a nocturnal occurrence, Rashi says, but the Torah speaks about that, which is more common, which is that this occurrence happens at night. And so therefore, such a person, there's a positive commandment, he has to leave the camp. He cannot go into the camp. Which camp can he not go into? This is a negative commandment that he's not allowed to go into the Levi camp. And for sure, he can't go into the camp of the divine presence. So let me translate this into a language that's more understandable today. So basically, if a person, what's more understandable today is that if there's a person who has a man who has a seed that issues forth from his body, he's not allowed to go into the Levi camp today, or for sure not into the divine camp. What's the Levi camp today and what's the divine camp? Where is he not allowed to go? So he's not allowed to go, speaking directly, the Temple Mount. You want to go into the Temple Mount today? You can go into the Temple Mount, but what do you first have to do? All the males have to first, and also the females, but it's a trickier thing. Before you can go up on the Temple Mount, the males have to immerse in a mikvah, in a kosher mikvah. Normally, males don't have to immerse in a kosher mikvah. They just, like, generally speaking, have to go into like a swimming pool or a large very, very, very large bathtub. But in this case, if they had any mission, they have to, and they want to go on the Temple Mount, they have to go into the mikvah. But even that doesn't allow them, and they for sure cannot go into the actual place of the temple on the Temple Mount. They can go in the outskirts of the temple. To go into the actual place of the Temple Mount, there you'd have to have the ashes of the red heifer. But to go onto the Temple Mount itself, that you just need to immerse in the mikvah. So that's the law. Elon, come on in. We're right here. Yeah, of course, Elon. Okay, so this is the law of the nocturnal occurrence. Right, what? We're on page chapter 23, verse 12. Hello, Greg. How you doing? Brought your gartel? Oh, Baruch Hashem. All right. So he says, "Vayof no terev," and then towards the evening, your chatzbam, he can immerse himself in the water. And when the sun sets, Yavo tocha machaneh, he'll come into the camp. Yes, our friend Jerry has a question. Jerry, please ask your question so we could all hear it.
Sentence 11, where it says Davar Ra. don't do anything evil. But the, the 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 text goes on to talk about uncleanliness of the soldiers. What about bad behavior of Jewish soldiers against the enemy?
Well,
That
so
isn't
two
mentioned.
things. Two things. First of all, we're starting in the middle of the parasha because I didn't want to just start at the beginning. And but in the beginning of the parasha, it talks about the limitations on bad behavior against the enemies. When you come across a woman who's beautiful and you want to take her and kidnap her and take her to be your wife, the Torah talks about that. So that's the first thing. The second thing is so that's the first point. The second point is what Rashi explains. Rashi explains, no, guard yourself against anything evil happening to you, anything bad. And the way you guard yourself is by being ritually pure, because otherwise there's the concern that since it's a time of danger, if you don't keep the mitzvos, you'll be more vulnerable to danger. And so therefore you have to keep the mitzvos so that nothing bad happens to you when you're a soldier out on the battlefield. That's what they're saying now, that you can't get a sofer to do anything for you these days in Israel because everybody's checking their mezuzahs. All the soldiers are getting tefillin, all the, so it's very hard to get a sofer to do anything because there's just a limited amount of sofers and they're all busy because the soldiers all want things done for them during this difficult time. Okay, so that's the point, Jerry. Very good question. But it says towards the evening, Rashi says, Samach l'Arav Shimsho, he should admit that near the sunset on the day which he had the emission, he should immerse. And then once the sun sets, he'll be pure. Now we have another law, which is very unusual. And you're like, why is this even in the Torah? V'yati alecha michutz l'machaneh v'yatzatz Hashem achutz. You have to have a place outside the camp, and you should go out there outside. Rashi says, what are you talking about here? It means michutz l'machaneh chutz lanan, outside the cloud. And what do? You should carry a shovel with your weapons. When you sit outside, you dwell there. So you shall have a shovel, and then when you go outside to go to the bathroom, you dig, and then you go back and you cover up your
Number twos.
Yeah. So that's the concept here. Like, what is going on? Why does the Torah need to tell us about this? So Rashi doesn't say. He says besides the other implements, you have to have a shovel there to cover up your bathroom, because otherwise, when you're in what's the reason? Says the pasuk. The reason is Hashem is walking amongst you, to save you, to put your enemy before you. Your camp is holy. We don't want you to see. God doesn't want to see amongst you a shameful thing, and then you'll turn away from behind you. So this is the idea that if you want to be in a holy place, the holy place has to be treated with respect and with sanctity. So cover up yourself after going to the bathroom. It can't just be a place of filth. These are laws about synagogues. When one prays in a space that's sacred, you have to make sure it's clean. You have to throw out the trash. You can't have it as a disgusting place. Okay, so then okay, so now the next verse states, any questions about this? Okay, no questions. Says the pasuk. Oh, now we have another law. Lo taskir eved al adonav asher yinatzal elecha mi'im adonav. Let's say there is a Canaanite. Obviously, it's talking about a Canaanite slave, because a Jewish slave is not really a slave. So what are we talking about? You're not allowed to return a slave to his master if he ran to you for salvation from his master to you. So let's say a slave escaped and he runs to you. You're not allowed to return him.
Even so, does not encourage.
Let's see what Rashi says before we ask the question about it. Kitar gumo, you shall not give over a slave of non-Jews, meaning to say, a slave of the non-Jewish nations, you're not allowed to return him. Alternatively, afilu eved Kanani shel Yisrael shebarach michutz Eretz Yisrael. Let's say there's a Canaanite slave of an Israelite that ran away from outside the land of Israel to Israel. You're not allowed to return him. You have to set him free. You can't return him. You have to give him his freedom, because a Canaanite slave who's a slave to a Jew, he's allowed to force his master to either let me make aliyah or else you have to free me. You had a question, Jeffrey?
Yeah, I mean, there were a lot of slaves in that era.
Yeah.
Non-Jewish slaves, obviously. Doesn't that encourage, if it's legal in the country where these slaves are, including Israel.
Yeah.
So you can't return them if he runs away.
Well, you're certainly not allowed to give it. There's two ways he can gain freedom. One, if it was from a non-Jew, he was a slave to a non-Jew and he runs to a Jew, you're not allowed to return him. And number two, if he was outside the land of Israel and he ran to the land of Israel, you're not allowed to return him, because in each case, he's elevated his holiness.
How can you have slavery of Canaanites if they're allowed in Israel? You would never have when they go run away to Jews and you have to free them.
Exactly.
Well,
so they're setting the underpinnings for getting rid of slavery. This wasn't something of a fight in the Civil War era, that if there were slaves in the South and they ran to the North, what was the halacha? What?
Fugitive slave.
And what was the law? What was the law?
It was called the fugitive slave.
And what was the law?
Oh, the law was that you needed to return someone even if.
So it's against the Torah. The Torah says that you don't return them. The Torah says you don't. All right, well, that's what basically is. This is the rabbinic way.
Slavery for many years before the fugitive slave law.
I understand.
Meaning the slave owners made sure the slaves didn't leave or didn't flee.
Right.
But so what Dan is saying, that they had the slave, even though they didn't have the fugitive slave law, there was still slavery existed, and they just kept them there. But the point is also, even when there was the fugitive slave law, I'm guessing that in some states it was quote unquote a dead letter law, that it wasn't enforced. Like they didn't really enforce it.
That's what we ended up fighting this, right? That led to the Dred Scott decision.
Yeah.
That led to
Right. So
right.
Right. So the point is that the Torah says this is in the Torah, and the Torah is basically, even though the Torah allows for slavery, the Torah creates with certain laws the underpinnings to completely demolish the system of slavery. This is one example. Another example is that if you kill a Canaanite slave, you're judged with the death penalty as though you killed a human being. So these are contradictions to the idea of a slave, are these laws. Yeah, and Jerry, please ask your question, Jerry, please.
Yes, I read that during the American Civil War, there was a Reform rabbi in the South that spoke out against slavery. He took a great danger.
So in the Civil War era, there were some rabbis that were supporting slavery and some rabbis that were against slavery. And in the end, the Jews were on both sides. The Jews were in the North and the Jews were in the South. Like Americans who were on both sides, there were Jews on both sides, and there were Jews on both sides in World War I, and there were Jews on both sides in the Vietnam War, and there were even Jews on both sides when Hitler first came to power. When Hitler first came to power, there was a group of ultra-Orthodox rabbis who sent him a letter saying, "We support you. We're not like the other Jews. We know that you're good for us." So there's always been Jews on both sides. That's just the reality. That's just the reality. Okay, so then, okay, so hold on. Oh, 1 second. Okay. So then the verse says as follows. Next verse. He shall dwell with you in the place, but in the place you will select, in one of your gates, betovlo, which is beneficial to him. Lo tonanu, you shall not taunt him. Yeah, you're not allowed to send him back. Next verse, verse 18. Lo tia kedesha mi benot Yisrael. There shall not be a kedesha is, Rashi says, ufkeres, mekudeshes muzumanes losnus. It's a prostitute. Not allowed to have one of the daughters of Israel be a prostitute. V'loya kadesh mi b'nei Israel. You can't have a male prostitute. So you're not allowed to have a prostitute. So, I mean, it seems a little bit like unnecessary to say this because you're not allowed to have, homosexual intercourse is always prohibited. Hold on, someone's at my door. Hold on.
I would just, for the record, I read this Rashi commentary to mean that if a slave of a Jew runs away, you don't free him. So that it didn't sanction slavery governments by Jews. This is referring only to a slave.
No.
A non-Jew.
No.
Well, that's what.
But wait 1 second, Jeffrey. It says Rashi, the first Rashi says it, Kitar Gumo, like the Unkwa says, meaning to say a slave of the non-Jewish nations. Unkwa says that explicitly. He says like this. Listen to what Unkwa says. He says, Lo taskir eved amamin, a slave of the nation. So if there's a slave of the non-Jewish nations who runs away to you, you're not allowed to return him. That's what Rashi says. And then he gives
slave non-Jewish nation.
no, a Canaanite slave of the non-Jewish. No, for sure, a Jewish slave of the non-Jewish nations, you're not allowed to return. But even a Canaanite slave of the non-Jewish nations who runs to you, you're not allowed to return him. And before you say anything, the answer is very simple. A Canaanite slave who comes to you, you convert him automatically to Judaism. He's a Canaanite Jew. He's got half of the commandments. He observes the commandments like almost like a woman does. He's exempt from time-bound positive commandments. So before he wasn't Jewish. Now he comes to you and he's not allowed to work on the Shabbos anymore. So of course you can't send him back to this lower level. And then this next explanation is even a Canaanite slave of a Jew, you're not allowed to return. So for sure you can't return the Canaanite slave of a non-Jew who comes to you, because such a person is going from a higher level where he's not allowed to work on Shabbos, and now you're forcing him to work on Shabbos. But even if he's the Canaanite slave of a Jew, where anyways he was Jewish, he wasn't working on Shabbos, you're not allowed to send him back because now he's living in the land of Israel, whereas before he wasn't living in the land of Israel. The land of Israel is enough to grant you your freedom. So that's the way Rashi says to read it. That's the way Rashi says to read it. Okay, but now we have this idea of this. You can't have a prostitute, which is itself. Why does the Torah need to translate it? Of course you can't have a prostitute. You can't have a male prostitute. The male is not allowed to engage in any of those relations. And you can't have the female prostitute. Of course, she's not allowed to engage in extra marital intercourse. So Rashi says, Unkos explains it. A woman from the daughters of Israel should not become the wife of a slave. So let's say you have a Canaanite man who's become your slave. So like I said, he's a quasi-Jew, or you forcibly convert him to Judaism. Then you cannot allow him to marry a Jewish woman. Because since they're not formally married by Jewish law, it's like she's engaging in illicit relations. Because the Canaanite slaves are compared to donkeys, whatever. But the point is that, and also a man from among the sons of Israelites shall not take a slave woman for a wife. So basically, it's telling us that let's say you have this Canaanite slave amongst you. Well, you're not allowed to, even though they're quasi-Jews, you can't marry them to somebody who's a full Jew. Not the man or the woman, because that creates this relationship which is not permitted.
There's a special guilt offering just for that, no?
That's for a woman who is a half slave, half free. That's
Yeah, so-
that's talking about a half slave, half free. Here we're talking about a total slave.
Okay, and what will be the punishment according to this verse?
I don't know what would be the punishment. A prohibition. You're in violation of prohibition. Give them lashes. Give them lashes.
Before, after, during, that's what I'm
After,
asking. Like,
after. There's not the law of the Shivcha Charufa. That's a different one. That's the Asham. That's a different one. But now I go to the next case. Now this is a good question for if there's any attorneys. So lo tavi etnan zona umechir kelav beis Hashem Elokecha. You're not allowed to bring the etnan zona. Hold on one second. You're not allowed to give the etnan zona or the price of a dog to the Beis Hashem Elokecha Chol Neder. Meaning to say, what's an etnan zona? You paid a harlot. How did you pay the harlot? With a sheep or a goat. You can't bring that as an offering in the temple. Ki toavat Hashem Elokecha gam shnehem. Or if you traded a dog, let's say you traded the dog and you got a sheep in exchange for the dog, so you can't. So the harlot can't bring her sheep or her goat. And the person who traded away his little pet dog and got a sheep, he can't bring that as an offering. Now, what about if you took the harlot took her sheep or a goat and she traded it for a different sheep? Could she then bring that as an offering? Do you follow my question?
Yeah.
Yeah, but what's your other option?
Rashi says no.
Let's see what Rashi. He doesn't say no there. He doesn't say that. Where do you say he says no?
So this comes to include their exchange.
No, but okay, let's see what it says. Let's see, maybe you're right. Let's see what the Rashi says. At Nanzona, Nasan if he gave her a sheep as her fee, it's going to be disqualified from being brought as an offering. Umachir kelav, the price of a dog. Hechlif sebek kelav, if he traded a sheep for a dog. Gam shneim, the rabos shinuyayim. This includes their transformations. Could go on chitim if the harlot took wheat as her fee and someone received it in exchange for a dog. V'asan soes. No. So what that means is not. Dan, it's different. What Rashi's saying is, if you take the wheat, if you gave the harlot the wheat and she turned the wheat into flour, and now she wants to bring the flour, that's not allowed. But if she traded the wheat for a sheep, that's already a different item. That the Gemara says that you'd be allowed to bring. That's already another remove, because you don't track the money forever. You don't track the money forever. It's just if it's the same money, it's just in a different form. Then it becomes prohibited to be brought as an offering. Yeah, Jerry.
I
Jerry.
read that, yes,